All right. That song always does it for me, right? Yeah, God bless George Michael. Okay. Um, what is on what pasuk, what verse from the Torah is on the Liberty Bell? You know? Some of you know, right? What's on the Liberty Bell? Maybe the Torah confused. What's on the Liberty Bell? Proclaim liberty throughout the land for all its inhabitants. I see Joe Schwartz raised his hand. So Joe Schwartz knew. I'm going to trust that Joe Schwartz knew.
It's 25:10.
Oh, chapter and verse, right? Like, the Protestants really have us beat on that front. So we got to start learning our chapter and verse. Okay, that's right. Proclaim liberty throughout the land for all its inhabitants is inscribed on the Liberty Bell. It's there in Philadelphia. My father once took me to go visit it. So that's an incredible thing that a verse from our Torah is there on the Liberty Bell. And it makes some sense, right? Because aren't we a tradition that celebrates freedom? Isn't that our founding narrative? Isn't that what Passover is all about? Zman cherutenu, the time of our freedom. Freedom is a big concept in Jewish tradition, but there isn't actually a common or a commonly used word for freedom. That language I just quoted from our prayer, Zman cherutenu, the time of our liberation. Cherut is a rabbinic word. Cherut, that's the rabbinic word for freedom. It's much later usage. It doesn't appear in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible that way. And in fact, in the story of the Exodus from Egypt, there isn't really a reference to freedom, right? I will free you. There are a lot of other words like redeeming. I will redeem you, right? Which is kind of like purchasing you. I will take you away from your master. And then, of course, the big word is yitziah. You will go out. So you will leave this place of bondage, and bondage is certainly a word, but freedom in the way that we talk about it sort of post-enlightenment as a kind of value unto itself, doesn't appear all that frequently in the Torah, but it does appear once. And it is in that verse, you proclaim liberty throughout the land. And the word for liberty there is a very unusual word. And the word is dror. It's kind of like sounds like drawer, like pulling a drawer. A DROR is probably the way I would transliterate it. Okay, so that's the word that we're going to be meditating on for the next hour. We're going to have a kind of a poetics class. We're going to think about this word and what it means and how it's been read and how it is in context and how it is in other contexts. And so that's our task for today. So let's make a blessing and then we'll dig into freedom. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank God for giving us enough freedom to be able to have access to our sacred traditions. Not all of our people have had that freedom. Okay, let's take a look. Okay. I'm seeing someone had video and audio delay. I don't know. I hope that Ellie finds her way back into the class. Okay, Vera, maybe look out for that. Thanks to Vera, who's Ellie's back. Great. Thanks to Vera, who's running our show today. Okay, here is a source sheet, and here is the appearance of the word freedom or liberty, as the Bell translates it. There in this week's Parsha. This week's Parsha, I should say, is Parshat Behar. We usually read it along with Parshat Bechukotai, and so we forget that Behar is a very short Parsha, but it's almost exclusively devoted to one thing, and that is the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year. And Vera, if you can share the podcast, I sort of explained what the Jubilee year is in the podcast this week. But in short, every 7 years, there's a sabbatical year. That's let the land rest. Don't grow crops on the land. Just don't farm the land, in other words. and the poor can come by and take whatever they want. And so no farming on the 7th year. We're actually in a Shemitah year right now. But then every 7 times 7 years, right, that's 49. The next year, the 50th, is a Jubilee year. And the Jubilee year is an extra sabbatical year, but it's sabbatical plus. It's sabbatical year. All of those same regulations of not farming the land, but more. There's more. And so let's take a look at what happens in the Jubilee year, that 50th year. Okay, you shall count off 7 weeks of years. That's a funny way to phrase it, but it's picking up on our Sfirat HaOmer language, our counting of the Omer. You shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years. So that the period of 7 weeks of years gives you a total of 49 years. It's a funny phrasing, but 49 years is the point. Then you shall sound the blast of the shofar. Vavarta shofar trua. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, the Day of Atonement. That's Yom Kippur, Biyom HaKippurim. That's actually what I talked about in the podcast, not what we're going to talk about today. But this all happens in the 50th year, the 10th day into the year, Yom Kippur. You shall sound the shofar throughout the land, and you shall hallow the 50th year. You make it sacred, and here it is: Kidashtem et shnat hamishim shana. Ukaratem dror ba'aretz. You shall proclaim liberty throughout the land. Ukaratem dror. There's our word, dror. Daled resh vav daled, dror. You shall proclaim liberty throughout the land. Lechol yoshveha, for all its inhabitants. Okay, that's the Liberty Bell quote right here. You shall. Actually, it just starts with proclaim. Proclaim liberty throughout the land for all of its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Yovel hi tielechem. Each of you shall return to your holding, and each of you shall return to your family. Meaning everybody goes back to their family's ancestral plot, those plots of land that were assigned by God as they came into the land. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow, neither shall you reap the aftergrowth or harvest the untrimmed vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You may only eat the growth direct from the field. Okay. Now, there's lots to think about with the Jubilee year. That's the big subject this week. But for our purposes, I just want to try and focus on this proclamation: freedom throughout the land. Now, in the context that we just read, what is the freedom that is being proclaimed throughout the land? And there is an answer. There is a straightforward answer to this, and which is discussed later in the Parsha, which is that all who are in servitude go free, right? All who are in servitude go free, no matter where they are. There's a rule that you can be in servitude for 6 years, and you go free in the 7th year. But no matter where you are in that cycle, or if you chose not to go free in the 7th year, doesn't matter. Everybody goes free in the 50th year. Okay, so all Hebrew slaves, I should say. Like, it gets complicated. Slaves that you capture from war from other nations, that doesn't necessarily apply. And Lindsay Boyd is going to be speaking about that this Shabbat. So come to Shul Shabbat this Shabbat. But for our purposes, what is this freedom in context? Why this moment of like scream it out, the freedom? What is the freedom? What is the freedom? I guess maybe it's just as simple as what I said. All who are in bondage go free. But what else do we see in this passage that gives us some understanding of this word that we rarely see in Tanakh at all? So yeah, what do you read here?
Well, I know that the freedom of debt is another thing that lifts the weight not only off individuals, but it doesn't keep people in this syndrome of debt and poverty. So when that's lifted from them, then they can start over, and it levels the playing field for everyone, and it gives people hope.
Okay, excellent. So Yael the problem is I wanted to give us some of the context, but the whole Parsha spells out the various laws of the Jubilee year, and so there's more here, and Yael is bringing some of that in for us. So there are many there are many rules of the Jubilee year and even of the sabbatical year. One of them is all debts are released. Okay, so everybody goes back to their original plot of land. That's one property reset. Like all land that's been purchased in the meantime, that's too bad. Everybody goes back to their original family plot. And another economic regulation is that all debt is released. And Yael says, okay, so there's the actual release of those in servitude, but also there's a release of all who are in economic bind. And so we start to get the feeling that this year is about all kinds of freedom, economic freedom as well as physical freedom, right? And what else? What other kinds of freedom? So Matt, what are you seeing here?
Sorry.
Calling people.
Thank you. It feels what one of the meanings of the word natural these days. Let things be as they're supposed to be without all that work we've done to it. So it's, and now saying that, I hear another echo of Shabbat, but it's like the way things are supposed to be. Go back to your land, don't be plowing, don't let everything be. I would use the word natural here in that sense of the word.
Good. That's good. Okay, good. So Yael picked up on some of the economic implications and regulations in the Jubilee year, and Matt is picking up on the agricultural regulations of both the sabbatical and the Jubilee year. And as we read, you just let the land go free. The language is actually quite striking. You may only eat growth direct from the field. Right? You just let it grow. You don't trim anything. And Matt says that's also part of the spirit of freedom, is just let everything be as it is. Let everything grow as it grows. Stop. Farming is a form of regulating, constricting, and limiting the life of the ground, of the plants from the ground. And so too, just as people are being released in all kinds of ways, so just let the land be. There's a larger kind of almost ontological freedom. Everything is just free to grow and be. Okay, great. That's a great framing that Matt is offering us, and let's keep that in mind as we start to think about the many ways that we might describe the concept of freedom, the proclamation of freedom. Okay. All right, let's take one more thought on this, and then we'll push forward a little bit. Payam?
It's the right to start over. You're almost putting like a 50-year cap on whatever you do, and whatever happens, it doesn't go on in perpetuity. There's 50 years, and then after 50 years, no matter who you are, no matter what choices you made, you can start over. I think it's a really interesting, different concept.
Yeah.
Quality.
Yeah, so I might say the way that Payam's framing it is freedom from the past. Freedom from what was, freedom from the mistakes I've made, freedom from the deals I've been lured into or mistaken. Like I can start over again. I can just, today I move forward. I am free. Everything is, and it's not like, oh, I'm going to start over again, but everybody's starting over again. So it doesn't put you in a position of vulnerability to be restarting your life. The whole society is starting over again. So and that's a powerful framework that Payam is giving us. What does it mean to think of freedom as the blank slate, the ability to just see what happens? Okay. All right, great. I see some other hands come up, and I think the way that this class works, all of our comments will be relevant at all times. I'm going to keep kind of feeding us. I'm going to keep feeding us descriptions, impressions, interpretations of the word freedom, and or the word drawer here. And the first that I want to turn to is that of Rashi, and we're gonna do a kind of a classic thing today where we look at the big three commentators: Rashi, the Ibn Ezra, and the Ramban, the sort of the most classic of the medieval commentators, and Rashi, the most classic of all. So first stop is Rashi, and Rashi's bringing us a citation, as he usually does, from the Talmud. So let's see Rashi's definition of freedom, and see if it it adds or sharpens anything we've said so far. So here's Rashi's. Okay, Rashi says, "You shall proclaim liberty." Dror. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. In the Talmud, Rabbi Yehuda said, "What is mahu lashon dror? What is the etymology of the term dror?" This everybody agrees in the Talmud, by the way, that it means cherut, freedom. That seems to be consensus. But what is the real meaning of it? And Rashi quotes, "Kim dayar be daira." It's like one who dwells, madayar, in a dwelling, daira. Okay, that's weird. It's like one who dwells in a dwelling. It's like someone who is dira in Hebrew, in modern Hebrew, is an apartment. So it's a little bit, the language is a little bit like a temporary dwelling, right? Not in a bait, a house, but just in a dwelling place. And what does Rashi say that means? It means that he may dwell in any place he pleases and is not under the control of others. Shadar b'chol makom shehu rotzeh. He dwells wherever he wants. Ve'eino birshut acherim. He is not, and here's another word we're going to pay attention to. Reshut. Reshut here. Reshut means domain. It's probably the most straightforward. The reshut, like we say, reshuta rabim is the public space, and reshuta yachid is private space. So it's different domains, but the way Rashi is using it here, it's control, which is also not under the domain, under the dominion of. Okay, so this is quite an interesting formulation that the Talmud has chosen. Of all the, we've already heard some great suggestions for the how this dror echoes throughout the passage and throughout the institution of Jubilee. Rashi wants us to focus on the idea that someone can live wherever they want, and nobody's telling them where to live. So why focus on that? What does that add here? What does that add here? Now I said okay, so I'm going to start with Cindy and then turn to Ariella.
Okay, so this is like particularly meaningful to me. I was raised Mormon, and this whole concept of what we're talking about is all the reasons that from the time I was 4, I couldn't understand how grown-ups were accepting the teachings. And so the freedom to dwell anywhere that you please is kind of metaphorically how I see the freedom to dwell in the moral framework that I choose. It's, free, like it's, what's it say? It's, the freedom to live like from chronic shame. In Mormonism, there's a lot of fear of the consequences of your past and fear of the future. And now I don't have to live within that framework.
You're in your own domain now.
Exactly.
Your own intellectual, spiritual, psychological domain as well.
Absolutely.
I love what Cindy's done with that, right? And I think Rashi is pushing us there, and Cindy picks up on it, right? Which is to say that Rashi's taking it literally because it's about etymology. So it's about like dwelling somewhere, and you're not, you don't have a landlord. You don't have you don't have anyone telling you what to do. You can go wherever you please. And then the language of not being birshuta cherim and under the dominion of others is that kind of, Cindy's picking up on that and saying, what does it mean to be under the dominion of others? You might be on their property, but you also kind of have to submit to their control, their worldview, their way of thinking, being. It's like liberation from not just the place you grew up in, but maybe the culture you grew up in, and maybe the worldview that you grew up in. There's something about this person who's able to dwell wherever they please. That's liberation, is freedom of movement and freedom of consciousness, of conscience, right? Okay, so that's good. You want to add to that, Cindy? I'm not hearing you. You're muted.
Just a very concise example of what this looks like to me is growing up, I always loved to spend time with the special education kids, and I chose to help them eat lunch and read to them, et cetera, during my recess time. But according to the domain that I was forced to live in, that didn't matter if I had an impure thought. So I was forced to kind of be in this chronic shame state that I couldn't understand why the good things I did didn't matter if I did drink coffee. So yeah, just freedom from chronic shame.
Yeah, being in a kind of a psychically being in the dominion of others, right? Just sort of like one's very thoughts are under the control of, under the regulation of some other domain, instead of some kind of one reshut yachid, one's own personal private space to be, to live, to think, to feel. Okay, good. We're already in very, very philosophical space here. Okay, so let's keep pushing forward. Ariella, what do you think?
Well, what I think is everybody is at a common denominator. There isn't this me above you, you above me, the rabbi is above the people. It's everybody is one. Good,
right, good. There is some suggestion here. If there's a dominion that you can be subject to, that means there are authorities. There are people in control. Sometimes we even use the word reshut, that dominion word, just as a way of speaking about the government. Right? I'll tisvare l'rashut. Don't become too familiar with the ruling authorities, they teach in Pirkei Avot. Because the Romans are great at building aqueducts, but don't in the end, they're in control, and that's, you gotta be careful. So there's some hierarchy being suggested here by Rashi, and Ariella says, so it must be that freedom means some sort of leveling. And indeed, the Jubilee levels the playing field. But Ariella is saying also the leveling of status. Nobody is the rabbi. Nobody is the priest. Nobody is the king. Nobody's in charge. Okay, it's getting kind of radical, right? Kind of radical, kind of quickly. Okay, so let's. So that's, now we've got the context of Dror as it appears in our passage, context of the Jubilee year. Tease that out a little bit. Now we've got Rashi's very specific idea of the one who can go where they please and is not subject to the dominion of others. Okay. Now I said we'll be dealing in poetics here, and it's the Ibn Ezra. The other, like if we're clicking down the most famous, the most classic medieval commentators, it's Rashi and then the Ibn Ezra. Rashi is like 11th century, Ibn Ezra is 12th century. I always get this century thing wrong. It's so annoying that 12th century is the 1100s and 11th century is the 1000s. It's just so annoying. But okay, so Ibn Ezra is just a little bit later. So and Rashi's French and Ibn Ezra's Spanish, and that. Okay, fine. There's just some biographical details. But here's the Ibn Ezra, who is also different from Rashi in that Rashi is usually just citing the tradition, whereas the Ibn Ezra is much more of a grammarian, a language guy, and here he's going to give us some linguistic connections, some linguistic echoes that he has found in other parts of the Hebrew Bible. So let's take a look at what the Ibn Ezra says for some very beautiful imagery, some very tender imagery in his attempt to define dror, this liberty. Dror, liberty, freedom. It is known that this means something like free, chofshi, kmo chofshi. Here's another word for freedom, chofshi. Okay. And then he quotes Proverbs. As the flying swallow. Okay, the word here, dror. Let's see if I can. Let's see. We'll do it just to prove him right. Let's do a little definition here. This is a very cool feature of Safari, is you can just click on a word and it'll give you. Okay, here we go. So flowing, free one, liberty, flowing, liberty, a swallow, a bird. Okay, so. A bird. So one word for dror, a dror is a swallow. like a little bird. And now take a look at what the Ibn. So that's a quote from Proverbs, like a flying bird, like a flying little swallow. And why connect it to that? It seems like a different usage of dror. Why connect it to that? And the Ibn Ezra says, it refers to a small bird that produces music when it is free. Of katan minagen keshehu berishuto. And here I told you to look for this word, reshut, but it's that same word, when it is free, under its own domain, right? Like same word there. However, if it is taken captive, V'im hu bereshut adam, by people, if it's in our reshut, it refuses to eat and will starve to death. And will starve to death. Starve itself to death. Okay, so I don't know about the science of this, but that's quite a striking image to bring to our consideration of dror. Dror is like the freedom of a bird in its natural, in flight, in its natural domain. Because, and now this is, I'd love to hear thoughts on what this says about freedom. But the bird, when we capture the bird, it doesn't chirp. It doesn't produce music. But when it's free, that's when we hear the bird chirping. That's when we hear the bird singing. So I don't know if there's some biologists out there that can help us, but just in terms of the poetry here, what is the Ibn Ezra adding to our concept of freedom so far, which we've been processing through the human realm, and suddenly we have this new idea that a bird can be free too. A bird can be free too, and when a bird is free, it sings. Okay, so Leah, what do you think of that?
We have this in the water, by the waters of Babylon. How can we sing our songs when we're enslaved?
And why? That's a great connection. That's a great connection. We can't, when we're really in bondage, enslaved, we don't have the voice to sing. But what does that mean? Why can't we? Let's sing.
I think we're projecting onto birds what is in our own hearts. Is that when we are in bondage, we're heartbroken, that some basic essential thing is being oppressed, and therefore we cannot realize our true natures, and we can't fly. Our consciousness cannot fly, that we're earthbound because of the bondage.
Yeah. Our hearts are broken, right? There is, I'm thinking as you're talking, I'm like thinking of all of the incredible music that slaves have actually produced, but it's a different kind of music. It's a music of heartbreak, right? And the chirp of the bird is like free music, like liberated music. So what does it mean to have a free heart that can sing its song? It's like, so it sounds like I'm being, rabbinic, I'm giving a sermon, but that's what the Ibn Ezra is asking us to consider, is to be free, proclaim the kind of freedom that the bird in flight knows, that kind of freedom, not the bird in a cage, right? Not the bird in a cage. Matt.
Well, I was just thinking of the word joy, singing is associated with the opposite of bondage. So it's an expression of joy, not freedom brings people joy. Yes.
That's a profound thing to say, that we speak of freedom as a quality unto itself, not being in bondage, but having, as Rashi would put it, freedom of movement, being self-empowered, having control. And Matt suggests something I think we know to be true, and maybe the Ibn Ezra is suggesting it as well, but it's not necessarily obvious, which is that we associate freedom, the quality of freedom, the sort of, sometimes it's even a political concept, but we associate it with joy, right? Like the liberty, is the liberty to pursue, to pursue happiness, for example. But no, even more than that, being free itself is like a joyous state. There's something about feeling free that is feeling that happiness already, right? So proclaiming liberty throughout the land is asking people to rejoice. And after all, the Jubilee year is the year of rejoicing, right? So in order to rejoice, you need to be free. And being free is itself a kind of a joyous feeling, a joyous state of being. Okay. All right. Payam, you want to sneak in one more thought before we move forward?
Singing is a narrative device. It's how we tell our stories. And when it's captured, it has no more story to tell. The story ends, so it doesn't sing.
Wait, what did you say was a narrative device?
Singing.
Singing. Right. The music of freedom. What is the music of freedom? What is the sound of freedom? I mean, remember that we proclaim freedom throughout the land by blasting the shofar. There's an instrument involved, right? There's an instrument and there's a voice. You know, this idea that like we sing, we can speak, we can freedom of speech, but freedom of song, right? There's something there, something powerful there about our ability to sing our way to freedom, right? Or to sing out our freedom. I'm not sure which is the swallow and which is the egg, so to speak. Okay, let's take one more, but then I want to make a very surprising connection for you all. But Kathy Kobayashi.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is all really beautiful about the music and everything, but I keep looking at the other part of it, which is that it refuses to eat and starves to death. And I think this is also about food, actually, sustenance, the Shemitah and the Yovel are all about food. And how we get our food and I don't know, there's something there, it seems to me. And then there's also this kind of ambivalence all throughout about agriculture. I know I always go back to the Garden of Eden, but it's like there's something sort of not quite right. I mean, it's like it's not exactly punishment, that we have to farm or we have to work for our food, we don't just get it, but it's right there, and somehow we're not supposed to do it. We're supposed to kind of go back. Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot there. You've just given us quite a lot, Kathy. I appreciate all of that. First of all, Kathy, but importantly, before we move on from the Ibn Ezra here, reminds us that it isn't just, yay, the bird sings when it's free. And it isn't just that the bird stops singing when it's when it's captured, by the way, by us, Reshut Adam. The bird stops singing and then starves itself to death. That's pretty intense. And there's death there. There's a kind of the captivity. It not only robs the bird of its song, but also of its will to live. And also there's a way in which, this is the only, I think about like people who would starve themselves to death, right? In a situation of captivity or kill themselves. And that almost becomes the only form of freedom they have, right? The only form of freedom they have is to like, you want to hold me captive? Well, I can die, right? So, but Kathy, so that image in itself is worth pausing on, because it's quite as beautiful as the bird singing. So tragic is the bird who not only doesn't sing, but dies in the cage. So that's important. But then Kathy says, and it's no coincidence that the bird is not eating, because that's the concern of all of this. The concern of the Jubilee year is that some people are trapped in bondage, but also that some people are trapped in economic bondage. and everybody should be able to eat off the land. And everybody should be able to, that's the idea. The idea is just let the land grow and everybody can have, nobody is rich anymore. Nobody has debts anymore. No, everybody can just eat off the land. Now, but that seems like, well, let's try that, not growing crops once every 7 years, but there's a kind of a divine oversight to it all that seems to suggest you'll be provided for, you'll be taken care of. And then Kathy, as she always does, takes us back to the Garden of Eden, but that's exactly right. The sabbatical year, the Jubilee year, are hearkening back to the Garden of Eden, that sort of just things growing unregulated, and you come by and you take what you need. You just eat. And that's true freedom. But it's not, short of a Jubilee year and short of a Garden of Eden, it's not really possible. That we can't just let things be and everybody will have what they need. So we're always in a less than ideal state where we're trying to figure out how is it that someone can be the basic thing you would do with your freedom is feed yourself, right? If you're not able to do that, no matter whose dominion you're under, you are not free. Okay, so that's important. And it goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, but all the way through, as Kathy suggests, the Jubilee context itself. Okay. Now, I want to throw a kind of a twist into our analysis, and to do something which, if you know me, by now I love to do this. I love to do this, which is to find the one other place in the Torah, the one other place in the Torah where this word is used. And indeed, the word dror is only used 2 times in the Torah. And I'm like a firm believer that when the word is only used 2 times in the Torah, I think all of the linguistic connections between words are significant. There's echoes throughout the Torah. When there's only 2 usages, it's as if these 2 passages are speaking to one another, are in dialogue with one another, direct dialogue, you might say, with one another. And I think that, by the way, works whether God wrote the Torah or Moses wrote the Torah, or it was edited by, a team of editors. Just like somebody wants, there's only these 2 appearances of this word throughout the Torah. Somebody wants us to meditate on what the connection might be. And in this case, it's a very strange connection. It's it's going to require some meditation, because the other place that the word dror is used in the Torah, it doesn't seem to mean freedom at all. In fact, it is in the description of the making of the sacred anointing oil that the priests would use to anoint one another, and also to sanctify various objects in the tabernacle. What? Okay, what am I talking about? But take a look here. This is the other use of the word dror. The Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, now take choice spices, 500 weight, or 500 shkalim, just 500 weight, 500 weight, chamesh me'ot, of flowing myrrh. And that word that I'm translating as flowing, you might have seen it when I clicked on drawer before. That's another meaning for drawer, which is right here. Myrrh is more, or mar, or more, at this word here. And then this word in context means flowing myrrh. Okay, and that's a kind of a perfume. We'll talk a little bit about what exactly myrrh is, but that's the other use of the word dror. So now let's see the whole context here and try to figure out what might the connection be. Just linguistically, what might the connection be? Half as much, 250 of fragrant cinnamon, 250 of aromatic cane, 500 by the sanctuary weight. Here's where the shekel comes in, of cassia, and a hin, that's a volume unit, of olive oil. Now, this is like a recipe. Make of this a sacred anointing oil, a compound of ingredients expertly blended to serve as sacred anointing oil. With it, anoint the tent of meeting, the ark of the pact, the table and all its utensils, the lampstand and all its fittings, the altar of incense, the altar of burnt offering and all its utensils, and the laver and its stand. Thus you shall consecrate them so that they may be most holy. Whatever touches them shall be consecrated. You shall also anoint Aaron and his sons, consecrating them to serve me as priests. and speak to the Israelite people as follows. This shall be an anointing oil sacred to me throughout the ages. Shemen mishchat kodesh. Shemen mishchat kodesh. Yezeli ledorotechem. Okay, Shemen mishchat kodesh. By the way, today this is an aside, but today is Lag BaOmer, the celebratory day of the Omer, and it's celebratory because for many reasons, but one of them is that it's the Yortzeit, that the day of memory of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the great kind of mystical inspiration for the Kabbalah. And so I was trying to think if I could make any connection to Bar Yochai, but there's this great song, Bar Yochai nimshachta ashrecha. But so that's a great song. But one of the images that it borrows is Shemen mishchat kodesh, like you take the you've been anointed with this holy oil. Okay, so there's our connection to Bar Yochai. Okay, Bar Yochai, Shimon Bar Yochai. Our tradition says is the author of the Zohar, right? So, okay, why that? Now that's just an aside, but the Zohar and the mystical tradition, they were actually interested in the formulas, the recipes, like what's going on with this oil, what's going on in the temple with the spices and the oils and the, okay. So this is a kind of a different kind of Jewish text or Torah text, which is one that is much more about like the aesthetic sensory experience. But it's also the other use of the word drawer. So myrrh, first of all, what is myrrh? Some kind of, well, we'll talk about that. What is myrrh? But what does it mean that the other use of the word drawer is flowing, like flowing myrrh, flowing myrrh? Okay, so Payam's got an answer for us. I'm just gonna hold off just to see if I can bring anybody who hasn't spoken, thoughts on the connection between the freedom of the people in the land and the freedom of the myrrh, or the flowing nature of the myrrh. Okay. Just holding off for a second before I turn back to my dear friends. Okay, all right, let's turn back to Payam then.
I love that the word for flowing and freedom is the same, because if freedom is starting over, what's the ultimate story of starting over? Noah. And what is the story of Noah? Flowing waters. So it's all connected to Noah.
Okay, that's interesting, but I guess I love it too. But I want to ask, why are they related? What is the relationship? Here, let's do this again with the dictionary. Payam, suggests something interesting just with the story of Noah as another restart story, right? And I think Payam's saying you got to kind of wash away the old. Wash away the old.
Well, no, it's the story of water, flowing water.
Yeah. Okay. But let's just think again for a second about just the definition. It's, whoa, where is this? Okay, here we are. Yeah, let's just do this again. Drawer. A flowing, free run, liberty, flowing as of myrrh, or they give the two definitions because these are the only two we really have. Flowing as of myrrh or liberty. And then, of course, the swallow of the bird. Now we've seen everything the dictionary has to offer. So, but what's the connection between the flow of a fragrance and freedom, right? Matt, what do you think?
It seems to me that this is an obvious thing, that freedom, that flowing things move, that they don't have a single state to be in, a single location, a single shape, that, to use water, you put a piece of ice on a plate and it stays the shape it is. And you put water and it flows around and it moves. But I also just, as I said never mind. Yeah, that's it.
No, that's good. That's good. So that's great, actually, Matt. Matt's exactly right. And you imagine, a fragrance like just sort of, dispersing through the air, and that kind of the movement of those particles. And Matt's right. Matt's right that Rashi was right, that there is something fundamental here from the very start about the idea that freedom is related to freedom of movement, the freedom to just go and be and live and exist wherever you wish. And there's some relationship here now between that kind of freedom and the flow of a fragrant spice that can just who knows where it goes, it's traveling. And there's something important about that freedom is the freedom to flow, the freedom to wander, the freedom to just sort of, like drift out there, right? Almost like a fragrance. Rabbi Zaki.
Thank you. I just started thinking about song and the birds singing and our singing, and it goes out into the universe just like the flow of the wind or the
Very nice.
I'm just linking it back to that.
Yeah, that's very nice. We're seeing, Rabbi Zaki's reminding us that we're seeing in all of these images, the song that just leaves, and you'd imagine actually the echo, the sound waves echoing, right? The fragrance that just sort of disperses. And the
chanting of, like the chanting of the Torah. When somebody during services is chanting Torah, it changes the energy. It's flowing out.
Flowing out. Okay, the freedom to flow out. All right, good. So in our kind of poetic investigation here, this is an important connection. Jen Bailey-Guerra.
So I'm probably getting a little too metaphorical with the flowing thing, but bear with me. I've been thinking about how the Jubilee structure has this sort of ironic relationship to freedom, in that it is a structure that we place on freedom. It is freedom structured or constricted into one moment in time, and it implies and even necessitates lack of freedom in the other 49 years in order to be. You can't free anybody if there's nobody to free, right? So we have this like back and forth between freedom and restriction, socially, in the way that we personally relate to it, and in the way that we relate to flowing things or objects for which we have a use, right? It can't always flow, we have to catch it. We have to channel the flow so that it doesn't flow and destroy what we don't want it to destroy. The scent that disperses in the air, we're going to gather again and use at least in another 50 years. So this metaphor to me just does a great job of encapsulating that when we talk about freedom, we're also implying lack of freedom that exists in the shadow of it, and vice versa all the time.
Jen, I love the way you think. That's really, really interesting. That's really, really interesting. All of these structures of freedom are based on 6 years or 49 years or 6 days of not as much freedom, right? So there's a time of liberation. And the Torah is strange in that way. Very first law that the Torah gives after the great declaration of the 10 Commandments is that you should only keep a Hebrew slave 6 years, and then you have to let them go free. And it's like, what? How about no slavery, right? Like, what are you doing? But there's some idea here that like there's a moment of liberation, and what Jen is playing with is that maybe the kind of freedom that we're talking about, where something just kind of can go anywhere, that's so unregulated. I mean, after all, let's just let the ground grow unregulated. Well, eventually we'll all starve, because the cultivation of the ground, though it is very limiting, produces a system of produce, right? But we need sometimes to break out of that system. And so it is with perfume. You keep it in a bottle so that every once in a while you can spray and it goes out, right? You keep the anointing oil there so that it can flow over the, when you find King David, you bust it out, right? But there's a tension there. And I want to just add to that in that tension, part of what we're seeing is maybe there's some need for constriction sometimes, and therefore like some desire for liberation from that constriction. But there is also, make no mistake, too much constriction. And the bird that starves itself to death has been too dominated, right? And the slave that works for more than 6 years, that's too, again, we have a whole different paradigm now, but that's too much. There's a certain kind of it can't go on forever, even if we understand that part of what freedom represents is sort of chaos, entropy, and that we can't have all the time, right? So there's a real tension here. There's a real struggle here. Okay. All right, great. I want to show you one more text, in part because I want to check all my three boxes: the Rashi, the Ibn Ezra, and the Ramban. These are kind of the big three. And I'm always happy when I can turn to all three of them in the course of a class, but also because the Ramban offers us another image and does, with the dexterity that only he has, he does a great job of taking the drawer of the myrrh and the drawer of the Jubilee and finding a kind of weird connection between them, as Matt was doing, finding a kind of weird connection between them and giving us yet another image of freedom. So take a look at what he says here. He says, okay, here where I am. Okay, here we go. So here is the Ramban. Okay, so flowing myrrh. He's actually commenting on the flowing myrrh, right, back in Exodus. So he says the commentators, including, and I love just the way he puts this, Harav Rabbi Moshe, and he's referring to Maimonides, but he just calls him the master Rabbi Moshe. All of the commentators, they've generally agreed that myrrh is that perfume which is called musk. And moose, he calls it, musk. And musk is an animal perfume, and even describes later on a substance gathered in a glandular sac under the skin of the neck of a deer. Okay, does that sound right? I don't know anything about this stuff. So like musk is originally a kind of an animal scent. Okay, so but he says he's in Exodus, but he already knows that eventually this word will mean freedom. Meanwhile, others have explained that the word drawer is related to, and you shall proclaim liberty, freedom that we've been thinking about. Meaning, so how do you make sense of that? Well, they say, oh, maybe it's like freely flowing, so it's free from any imitation or adulteration. So it's pure, free of additives. But he doesn't like that answer. So what's the real connection between the freedom of movement and the myrrh of deer scent? Strange connection, but he finds one. But perhaps we can say, he says, that when the Torah requires it to be gathered when it's free, meaning that it should be taken from that deer while it is free. And listen to this language: wandering between the spice beds and enjoying itself at will. Because once it is captured and held in the possession of human beings, there's that word again. All of our commentators have used this word as the counterpode to freedom, reshut, dominion. But so the deer is wandering between the spice beds and enjoying itself at will, because once it's captured and held in the possession of human beings, it produces but little more or myrrh and does not have such a pleasant odor. And this, he says, is quite obvious. We know this. Now, I don't know how obvious it is. I don't know any of the science of that at all. But the imagery, I want to turn again to my stepfather. He's usually I lean on him in matters of biology. But the imagery is quite striking. It's actually similar to imagery we've seen before. Again, the human being capturing an animal, just like the Ibn Ezra imagines we capture the bird and the bird stops singing. But in this case, the Torah wants us to get myrrh or musk from a free animal, because if we capture the animal to get it, there's something a little different about this image. It stops producing the scent. It starts smelling bad, and it's weak and foul, right? So as we come to a close here, is there anything that Ramban is adding? This, in some ways, he does a beautiful job of connecting all of the two usages of the flowing freedom and the liberation freedom. But what else? Just one last image here. The deer that is captured, just like the bird that was captured, no longer produces a fragrant smell. I see Ariela's got a thought. So Ariela, you wanna offer an interpretation?
Well, yeah, just a free person thinks and can produce ideas and has a more free flowing than when somebody is in captivity, in dominion. They can't express the same ideas. They're limited as a person.
Beautiful, perfect, beautiful. That's exactly right. And this takes us back to Cindy's comments at the outset, right? That like you're in the dominion of another physically, but what that ends up meaning is that your whole being is subject to the control of another. And so this freedom drawer, this particular language for freedom, it does, Rashi's right, it does imply a freedom of movement. You have to be able to go where you please, just like a fragrant can go where it pleases. But what's important about that is that physical freedom is necessary for the freedom of whatever else comes out from within you. Ideas, says Ariella, or song, or I don't know, fragrance, whatever beautiful thing emits from your being. That you have to be physically free in order to be free enough to give voice to your essence, to give out that unique song, that unique voice, that unique idea, that unique part of your being. That also requires a kind of a liberation. But first we have to think about physical liberation, because a caged bird and a trapped deer and a subjugated human being in that kind of bondage simply can't give voice to that thing inside of them. And that's what we're really trying to liberate. So we have to liberate their bodies in order to liberate their souls. Great. That is a great place to end. So I wish you a happy Lag BaOmer, and I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.